So I want to welcome all of you, and I want to, without further ado, move to our keynote speaker, Martha Minow. Minow, I think I've got the pronunciation right, Martha, who is a 300th anniversary university professor at Harvard. She's taught at Harvard Law School since 1981, and she served there as dean between 2009 and 2017. She is an expert in human rights, constitutional law, advocacy for members of racial and religious minorities. And she has a book that's just come out called Saving the News, which sounds like an interesting title. So let me put Martha on. I love the backdrop. It's nice to see Harvard in the back. And Martha will speak for about 10 or 15 minutes, maybe a bit longer, and we'll have a little bit of a conversation, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So Martha, welcome to our webinar series.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see everyone come together in this way. Our nation leads all others in incarceration, 2 million people currently, and that's a 500% increase over the past 40 years. The United States has only 5% of the world's population, but 20% of all those who are incarcerated. Racial disparities throughout criminal law enforcement in this country are obviously well known to everyone. One promising development that I will talk about today is restorative justice. And as I discuss, it also helps to highlight further work that needs to be done to address issues of racial equality. Restorative justice refers to responses to harms and wrongs that focus on repair rather than punishment. These efforts promote encounters and cooperative meetings among those who are harmed, those causing harm, and other willing stakeholders to discuss what happened, and most importantly, to explore potential consequences and responses. Restorative justice programs respond not only to past harms, but also seek to transform relationships in communities and to remedy deeper injustices and prevent future harms. Sometimes called transformative justice because restorative implies a return to a world that maybe never existed. With the reforms that I am talking about actually are relevant not only in criminal law, but also in schools, potentially applicable to all age groups and all kinds of offenses. Restorative justice is taking off in this country in high schools, in juvenile courts, and increasingly in adult courts as well. It reflects roots in traditional and indigenous practices in many parts of the world, including the United States, and the United Nations and international bodies have embraced restorative justice. Mounting evidence shows that incarceration has little or no effect on crime. Some research shows that positive social engagement and stimulating environments can change people's actual neural circuits and affect capacities for empathy and regulation of emotion. These studies bolster both restorative and transformative justice. And some efforts are complete alternatives to the criminal process. Some work alongside the more formal justice mechanisms. An example of the latter arose after the death of a beloved philosophy professor in New York. His name was Young Kim. Matthew Lee was charged with killing Professor Kim, and the son of the victim and other family members agreed to meet with Lee. Each recounted from different perspectives the story of the professor's death and its effects. Lee explained how it was a mugging gone wrong. He had tried to grab cash from the professor who had just made a withdrawal from an automatic bank machine. He pushed Professor Kim, who fell, hit his head, and later died. Lee faced charges of felony murder, which is a death occurring in the midst of a felony, and he faced up to 25 years in prison. Lee said he never committed a crime before. He was behind on his rent. He had no money. The victim's son, in turn, talked of his sadness that his daughter would never get the chance to meet his father. His daughter-in-law said that the professor had hoped to write a book called Small Happiness, which of course would never happen now. Meantime, the offender's sister discussed missing her brother since his arrest and his incarceration, and Lee apologized and said that this occasion would stick with him for the rest of his days and his life, and he apologized. The victim's son said, "It will probably heal me more than anything else to hear that you're sorry." The hurt may never go away, who knows, but the hate I can control. Learning about this whole episode, Manhattan District Attorney, it was then Cy Vance, offered a reduced plea to manslaughter and a sentence of 10 years instead of the 25. This is an example of the kind of work that restorative justice can do alongside the existing justice system. And involving larger groups in the community can also occur, which requires training and roles for many people. In a school, it may be a training for security guards and cafeteria workers, as well as teachers and parents, and employers in the neighborhood. Here's an example from a school. Mercedes M. had enrolled in a California high school after she was suspended due to so many fights at her prior school. Two classmates at her new school accused her of stealing a pair of shoes, and they called her a liar and a thief and the B word. A facilitator started talking with Mercedes and earned enough trust to discover that Mercedes confessed she had stolen a pair of shoes. She also learned that Mercedes and the two other students had known each other for many years and had many prior disagreements and didn't know how to communicate with each other. They agreed to a facilitated conversation, and there they each expressed considerable anger. But after a time, Mercedes spontaneously apologized, and she explained that she had stolen the other girl's shoes in order to sell them to help her mother pay for a drug test. If her mother could prove to the court that she was clean, she might be able to get Mercedes' younger siblings returned to her from protective custody. When the other girls saw Mercedes crying, they empathized and they gave her a hug. They didn't ask for the shoes back, but they said they wanted a sign that they could start really fresh, and going forward, they could trust one another. Mercedes later reflected that without this process, she's sure the conflict would have escalated and she would have probably been suspended or expelled. With this kind of process, her school has reduced suspensions by half. Even more comprehensive restorative justice programs would involve other people in a community, and some programs attend to the trauma experienced by those who commit harms, as well as those who have been injured. Bridging school discipline and juvenile justice matters, restorative justice is the go-to legal tool now for prosecutors in the District of Columbia and the teen court in Los Angeles. Racial justice motivates both restorative justice initiatives and criticisms of them. The disproportionate effect of local and national criminal law processes on communities of color is mirrored by the racially disproportionate impact of school disciplinary processes in the school to prison pipeline. The possibility of less punitive, more forward-looking solutions, such as investments in safe hangout spaces and programs to deepen the social and emotional learning of students and to offer employment opportunities. These can all serve the interests of justice. Fania Davis, who's a leader of restorative justice programs, argues that the reductions in racial disparities and out-of-school suspensions and in-school suspensions show the value of these techniques for racial justice. Now, the interest in restorative justice reflects a kind of broader recognition of the values of many forms of justice that are different than the ones that dominate in the United States. Forms that actually have forgiveness and relationship building and repair as much more central elements. Forgiveness has its limits. Obviously, not everybody can forgive, and not every wrong should be forgiven. Pressure to forgive itself can reflect racial and gender hierarchies. But there is a way in which forgiveness can offer benefits to the offender, relieving a sense of isolation, offering solace and acceptance, and also benefits to victims who, by forgiving, can let go of their resentment. And many medical studies now show that letting go of resentment actually has calculable health benefits, everything from blood pressure to cancer prevention. Pressuring people to forgive, however, is another kind of victimization, not something that I think even those in favor of restorative justice advocate. I do think that there are possibilities, though, for cultivating more forward-looking approaches and finding ways that people in a community, even who did not cause a harm, can step in to make things better. Just as an example, if you think about the two cases that I've described, if Matthew Lee had some other place to go to deal with his impoverishment, he wouldn't have held up the professor. And more importantly, after the fact, if there is some incident like that, finding ways to actually construct solutions for others in the network of the family and of the perpetrator could prevent future crime. Or take the situation of Mercedes. If she was indeed propelled to steal a pair of shoes because her mother was caught up in the protective custody situation for other children and couldn't afford a blood test, couldn't there be some other solutions involving representatives of communities, advocates and others in ongoing conversations might be able to prevent those kinds of misconduct and harms. The criticisms of restorative justice are many. It takes time. As I've already mentioned, the idea of restoring relationships may be just a misnomer if there haven't been relationships in the past, and so transformative may be better in some ways to talk about what we're exploring here. But there are many interesting initiatives right now that bridge community and social work activities, community organizing, and crime response. A multiracial group called Coming Together creates opportunities for people to speak about their experiences and to join in halting racist activities, and also learning to manage emotions and rage. I think that there are other examples. There's a public radio show in Maine that actually brings mental health resources to people through the public radio. What about broadening the concentric circles of actors who contribute to the problems? The landlord who is about to evict Matthew Lee, the welfare staff worker who decides whether to return the children to the home of Mercedes and her mother. Hearing other points of view and developing actual problem-solving approaches, I think, is the kind of work that restorative justice organizations like Circles and Ciphers, which is a hip-hop infused group, are actually pursuing. And also giving young people the chance to use art and discussion and podcasts to explore their lives and come up with constructive ways to deal with their situations. Perhaps on the biggest scale in recent years in restorative justice is Canada's recent effort settling its largest class action in history, challenging the abusive treatment of children in Indian residential schools. And as part of the settlement, Canada established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for 6 years with a considerable investment, $72 million, developing opportunities for truth-telling, reconciliation, building a public record, and identifying 94 calls to action. This initiative has actually become a kind of model for many other countries. Although at the moment, there are 26 of those proposed 94 calls to action that have not yet been started. I think that there are opportunities, in short, under the general rubric of restorative justice for interpersonal problems, for alternatives to the legal treatment of crime, and also for more broad-based societal harms. Why not pursue these alternatives? They draw on the boundless resources that human beings can bring to bear, rather than locking people up, which clearly has not worked and destroys communities. I look forward to conversation.
Thank you, Martha. And thank you for setting out restorative justice as the key concept that we can start with. But I have a couple of questions. We have a number of questions also in our chat room that people are starting to pose. But restorative justice has been with us for a while. I mean, people have been, as you note, it's been going on as a viable concept for a couple of years. But if we're looking at reducing mass incarceration, particularly reducing excessive punishment, how would you institutionalize restorative justice so that it has an impact on that?
Well, it's a great question. And for this, I actually think the broader idea of forgiveness is a pretty helpful one. So take expungement, commutation of sentences. Many communities have developed laws that allow for people to actually be released early, not just parole, but for an example, when President Obama initiated a mass pardon program, it was based on a recognition that when the law changes, in that case, the changes in the sentencing period for certain drug crimes, people who are already incarcerated under the prior law should have some chance to be released. And that's what he did. He instituted a mass release of individuals who had been convicted under laws that had changed. Well, we have massive changes in the drug laws all over the country without that kind of reform because, of course, the president could only deal with federal crimes. What about state and local? But the one by one adjudication is very costly and difficult. And there could be developed mass programs to make it efficient. Similarly, sealing court records so that someone who has served their time can actually get out and, get housing and get a loan and get a job. Right now, we have collateral consequences of criminal sentences, even for people who have been released, that actually make it very likely that unlawful activity will recur. So I think that forgiveness, if I can just offer this broad historical perspective, it's been embraced by every religious tradition and many philosophic traditions since human beings began, not just for human beings, but actually there's evidence even that large mammals engage in forgiving activities. And we know from the Bible, we know from civilizations whose names we don't even remember, that there have been periods of mass forgiveness, specifically of crime and debt, wiping clean the slate for people to have a restart. One society about many centuries ago actually started the calendar anew along with this mass forgiveness. So I think the tools exist. We have historical examples.
One question that's the first question that I see in our Q&A window is, and you've answered it partly, is how would it work with returning citizens?
How would restorative justice work
Yes.
with returning citizens?
Would it be a condition of their release that they agree to a restorative justice conversation or dialogue?
I can see a community finding that very meaningful and escalating fast, moving on a fast track, early release of individuals who agree to participate in such programs. Now, it is a criticism of such programs that does not put a burden on victims. And I'm intrigued by the increasing growth of restorative programs that actually involve people who were victimized, but not in that particular instance, but who want to participate, who find it healing. So rather than make it a condition for each individual that the person they victimized has to spend time, I think it's very possible to involve others who have been victimized in another context, but participate in these conversations and constructive problem solving. And again, that broader concentric circle of other actors, I think, is even more important. Who are the employers? Who are the community organizers? Who are the social service agencies who can get involved?
From what I've seen and interviews that I've had with people who've been involved in the process, it's very difficult to get up to the point, if you're a survivor or a victim, to be willing to meet with the perpetrator. And it often takes anywhere from 6 months to a year just to get up the willingness to actually do that. And then it's a lot of pain to go through it. So that adds a lot of time to the process. It's just not a quick solve, basically. How do you respond to that? I mean, it's basically a one-on-one or case-by-case issue.
Well, you're right, and I do think that above all, the participation by a victim or a survivor has to be voluntary, and people are on their own journeys. But I have seen in many communities where there are people who live amidst large incarceration rates who want an alternative. And even when they have been victimized. And so I think that the responses will vary by communities and also by people's religious views. The health evidence to me is so compelling that it actually helps the victims to participate.
A question from Winston Johnson. You mentioned criticisms of transformative justice, and you mentioned one. It takes time. What are some of the others?
Well, as I've maybe alluded, there's some concerns that there could be a perpetuation of the racial disparities, especially if discretion is involved, because it's discretion that has led to racial disparities in the current system. This is obviously something to be concerned about and develop protective measures wherever this power of the state is used. Another is what we've just been talking about, that victims may not want to participate, and it may be putting new pressures and new obligations on people who've already been victimized. And a further is that it actually, let's be frank, doesn't have, if I could put it this way, the political economy benefits of the mass incarceration system. Yes. It doesn't fund jobs for unionized prison employees. It doesn't help elected prosecutors have another notch on their belt. So I think we have some deeper incentive systems that we need to alter to undo what brought us to this point.
That's an excellent point, and a little bit troubling because it's going to be a while considering the atmosphere right now of getting there. But I want to bunch two questions right on that point, read together. Is there any way that you can quantify the extent to which the use of restorative justice has grown? Do we know how many prosecutors' offices around the country now actively engage in restorative justice programs? Are they increasing?
I can tell you the Obama administration kept track. The Trump administration did not. So we have to rebuild the evidentiary basis. But I do think one of the most telling comments someone made to me is, why do we put such an emphasis on having better research on restorative justice when there's no evidence of the success or effectiveness of the prevailing form of mass incarceration? To the contrary. So the burden of proof, it seems to me, is actually on those who would oppose experimenting with something that, at least in small examples, has been shown to be effective.
Well, let me just follow up on that. How does that meld with the actual system we use right now? In other words, if restorative justice was at the front end of the process, before we got to the point of conviction, of sentencing, that would be one way of reducing the time, the number of people who actually go behind bars, if there's an alternative way to deal with the victims or the people they've hurt. I mean, there are programs like that. The Center for Court Innovation has lots of them. Do you see that as a way of institutionalizing the process in a prosecutor's office?
Well, there are at least two starkly different choices there. One, as you say, is through a prosecutor's office, and there are growing numbers of prosecutors, some so-called progressive prosecutors, but others who actually have a diversion track. And some are explicitly called restorative justice, and some, that's one of many options, but to keep the matter out of the former system. But there are other institutions or centers of power besides prosecutors that could be using these techniques. Again, community organizations, coalitions of religious groups. And just as the legal system, the formal legal system, has actually deferred to Native American tribal processes,
yes,
and said, okay, we recognize that you have independent authority here. We will not get involved. The same could be developed in communities that say, we will handle this in our own system. The assumption that the only racial disparity to be concerned about is mass incarceration undervalues the cost of crime to Black and Brown communities, which are highly likely to be victims, particularly in low-income communities. And they have many leaders who say, let us handle these issues because your system is not doing it.
This is a challenging question from Sylvia Harvey, and I'll read it as she wrote it. It says, much of society is opposed to restorative justice. People convicted of crimes, especially serious or violent crimes, are often dehumanized. So what are ways to get society to think of people convicted of crimes as multidimensional? What are the ways of teaching forgiveness? And that's really an important question because it goes to the heart of what we're looking at this week, is when we rethink people who we call offenders, people who are guilty, in different ways, we would punish them or deal with them in much different ways than we're dealing with them now.
This is such an important question, and there are several dimensions to it. One is the dehumanization of those who are charged with crimes, not to mention convicted of crimes. And there's such important work to be done in telling the stories about what actually is the life of an individual that brought them to a point of criminal conduct, and what's the effect of the criminal system on their family and on themselves. That's a crucial role for journalists and education. I actually think that the exploding interest in restorative justice in schools indicates that there will be a generational shift here. There are more and more programs that are peer-led, where it is students who actually lead the circles and facilitate the conversations. I've seen this in my law students. More and more of them, when they were in high school, had a restorative justice process, or when they were in college. And I think that there should be, in my view, actual direct instruction in elementary schools about these alternatives and about how to apologize. I think that we're living in a time of resentment. A good definition of forgiveness is letting go of justified resentment. There are lots of justified resentments, but forgiveness is a tried and true, multiple civilization tested approach to dealing with these problems. But in many societies and for many people, unless there's been an apology and some taking on of responsibility, forgiveness is not imaginable. But a lot of people in our world don't know how to apologize.
How do you recognize, this question from KT Originals, I think I've got the pronunciation correctly, that the restorative justice process has been successful? I mean, what do you use as a kind of metric to say, hey, it worked or it didn't work? For instance, would a perpetrator have to say first, in order to get involved in the process, that I am guilty, I did this, and that opens up the box for a real dialogue?
Well, there are two questions there. One is, how do we know if anything under this name is successful? And the second is, what should be the trigger for it? I think that there may well be multiple views that different communities have about the latter, whether someone needs to confess first. I think that for myself, the more important willingness is a willingness to talk frankly and fully about what happened, and to be participating in the conversation about its impact on other people. To say guilty at the beginning when people may not even understand what the consequences of that are, I would worry about that. But as to measuring its effectiveness, again, I think it has to be compared with the alternative, as opposed to just standing on its own. And one way to measure its effectiveness will require time. It will require time to see whether it reduces mass incarceration and whether it's cheaper. And for some people, it'll be important to ask whether it actually reduces the presence of the state in people's lives, or does it expand the presence of the state in people's lives? So there's lots of questions to be studied.
Two other questions I want to bunch together about the different areas where restorative justice might be applied. One is in public schools. Is there any data showing a significant impact on the school to prison pipeline? That's from April Kelly. And then from Hugh Lester, who asked whether there's a place for restorative justice in the local adult detention facilities or jails, where the average length of stay is 2 to 4 weeks. 85% are usually pre-sentence. Not a lot of time to negotiate a restorative justice agreement.
So great. There is some very impressive research on the impact of restorative justice in schools. The RAND Corporation, for example, has done studies, but I don't think it's measured by reducing the school to prison pipeline solely. And I would defer to others who may know more. As to the jail problem, this is such a central problem. I have a wonderful colleague named Sasha Nadapoff, who has written about the misdemeanor system. And then there are other important studies that show so many people, maybe 2/3 of those who are in jails in the United States, as opposed to in prisons, it's pretrial, and they're released before there's any further sentencing, or they are sentenced to time served. And so what we have is a legal system that is not anything like what TV shows. There are no hearings, there are no trials. There's just the threat of the state leading to mass incarceration. So I think we need a much different system and diversion at the front end. I am on the board of the MacArthur Foundation, which has funded an initiative exactly focused on that. And it turns out that there were more communities wanting to participate than the foundation could fund, wanting to find ways to reduce the jailing of people before there are trials. And there are some promising developments in that area.
Thank you. We have a quick question from Orlando Brand Williams, and then a much longer question. We've only got about 5 minutes left, but let me go to the quick question first, which is categorically, what offenses have had the most success with restorative justice? Which is a rather interesting question.
It's a great question. Again, I confess, I think we need more evidence. It is commonly used in nonviolent crimes. That is, there's much less resistance to using it if there is crimes to property, theft, and so forth. But there is at least some evidence of success in the instance of violent crime. So I think we need more study. I have, again, another colleague, Adrian Lonnie, who's a big advocate for the use of restorative justice, even in the instances of violent crime. So I would commend the research that is well underway in many parts of the country about exactly these questions.
So if you could give us a list of some of the research that's been done with their links, we'll be glad to post that on site, and then we'll spread it around to the journalists.
We'll do that.
The larger question is this one from Cassie Chu, which is asking you to say a bit more about how mass incarceration undervalues the cost of criminal justice to minority communities. So that would take a whole panel, I think, to discuss. Yeah. But if you want to just approach that briefly, and then if you want to have a longer answer, you can write it out and we'll send it. We'll post it.
Well, that is a huge and important question. Brian Stevenson, who is one of the most impressive leaders in this field at this time, said to me, "Look, I can win a case in the Supreme Court, but I can't change the narrative." And the narrative that he was concerned about is the narrative of criminality by low-income communities. And blame of poor people for their poverty. What he then turned around and has done, which I find incredibly compelling, is he's built on his great work for the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama by literally creating a museum and then a monument, a memorial. The museum draws the connections across slavery, Jim Crow, lynching, and now mass incarceration. And look, I'm sympathetic. And I thought before going to the museum, this is a little heavy-handed. I'm not sure I agree. I can tell you, having been through the museum, read all the exhibits, it's a very important story to tell. The destruction of of communities that has a continuity with those prior institutional practices of oppression. And then the memorial that is built is a memorial to lynching with incredible documentation of the much silenced story of vigilante justice in this country, killing people, largely Black people, outside the legal system and never accounted for. So I think that the destruction of minority communities, of poor communities, and the perpetuation of their impoverishment and of their barriers to succeeding in the society have to be located against these broader historical patterns.
Let me go back to a question as we close that was posed in different ways earlier on. I mean, are there some crimes, some offenses for which restorative justice is just the wrong approach, for which no apology is acceptable or conceivable, whether it's lynching, genocide, the murder of a child? I mean, is there a risk, and this is a question from Brooke Unger, that by using the restorative justice system, some crimes are made to seem more acceptable?
This is a huge question, and is the kind of question I would hope we could have much deeper, broader social debate about. I have my own personal views. I do think restorative justice in the context of genocide is unimaginable. However, Rwanda adopted restorative justice methods to deal with their genocide, but alongside criminal processes that were both international and domestic. I don't think it was terrifically successful, but it suggests that there are competing views on that very question. I take an area that I have written about, which is the treatment of child soldiers who've committed terrible crimes, who've committed murders and rapes. And I do believe that there are good reasons to explore restorative justice in the instance of people who were turned into criminals without their consent before they were adults. And yet when I draw the comparison between that and young people in this country who get caught up in gang and drug activity, there is a shift from the assumption, oh, of course we should do that with child soldiers, to instead, again, this old view of super predators, of young people in this country who don't deserve a second chance. We give second chances to people who commit crimes if they're white collar. We give second chances to people who engage in terrible financial misconduct. Why don't we give second chances to other people?
As we just about at the end, but I wanted to leave another minute or so for you to tell us and tell the journalists we're here, what do you think is the best way or appropriate ways for journalists to cover this subject as part of their sort of their crime beat? I mean, rather than just go out to a prison or to a jail and say, well, are you doing this? I mean, where would the journalists go from here? It's very difficult to cover, especially when these are such private sessions.
That is true, but I think that discussing...
Can
you hear me? Can you hear me? No?
No, you have to, we can't hear you.
Yes, I can hear you.
I can hear.
Okay, so others can hear me. Others can hear me, so I will proceed. It does seem like a great opportunity to explore with prosecutors and with others in communities.
Martha, can't hear you.
Others can hear me, yes?
Yes, I think it's Steve's problem.
Yeah.
I think this is Steve's problem.
Okay, so thanks. I think that there are great stories to be told. I had some of my students do a documentary film about a special unit in our prison system that was designed for veterans with restorative principles in mind. And there were lots of people who wanted to talk. And I think that there are many, many initiatives. There's, one of the few areas of bipartisan agreement is that our criminal legal system is broken. And there are initiatives all over the country. So there are stories to tell.
Okay, thank you, Martha. I think we're going to break it up now to move on to our next panel. But once again, thank you so much for your time. If anybody else has questions they want to pose to Martha, please send them to me in an email, and I'll send them to her, and we'll bundle the answers and put them on our site. But once again, it's a pleasure and honor to have I hope you can stay with us for part of the rest of the afternoon.